The mainstream media, and particularly the right-wing media, loves to talk about trans people, the trans movement, trans ideology. They have a lot that they like to talk about, but there are some interesting gaps in that coverage. And I've noticed a little bit of it myself, but I'm not an expert. So we decided, why don't we talk to an expert that's actually looked at the way that the media talks about trans people and to trans people, but often, interestingly, not with trans people. And so joining us to discuss this, the LGBTQ program director for Media Matters, Ari Drennen. Welcome back to the Damage Report.
Thanks for having me and for breaking the mold of this coverage by actually putting a trans person on your air.
Thank you. Always happy to have you on, and always happy to have anybody from Media Matters on. I've loved the work of your organization for more years than I've actually been in the industry. So thank you for the work that you do, and thank you for angering people as far back as Bill O'Reilly and now to Elon Musk. So thank you for that. With that said, we have a focus today on some of the studies that you've recently done for Media Matters. So you wanted to look at representation of trans people in trans media coverage. So tell me a little bit about what led you to start this study and what you found.
Yeah, obviously we're existing in a bit of a hyperbolic media environment when it comes to trans people and the issues that we face. Fox News, for instance, just spent well over 2 hours in the last week covering a coincidental overlap between Trans Day of Visibility and Easter. And so, there's a lot of anger out there, fear about trans people. And, we live in a country where 6 in 10 adults say that they do not know a trans person. So that media coverage can really make a huge difference in terms of whether they're actually hearing about the experiences and lives of trans people, or whether they're just hearing kind of, theoretical debates about an issue that they don't really know anything about.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that, look, I have some questions specifically about the way the right wing talks about this, but your study was not specific to just, what is the Daily Wire saying about this? So you noticed, like, seemingly reputable news sources like the New York Times often don't feel like they need to, or it's worth their time to actually talk to trans people about the coverage that they're doing. So the problem is bigger than just the right wing, correct?
Yeah, we actually looked at a full year of New York Times coverage of anti-trans legislation, and we found that 65% of the articles failed to quote even one openly trans person, which often, again, makes this feel like a more theoretical debate than something that affects people's actual lives.
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't necessarily have an abundance of respect for a lot of news outlets, but I would assume that if you were to look into New York Times coverage of, the destruction of Roe v. Wade, they'd probably talk to some people whose reproductive freedoms are being taken away. Like when the Voting Rights Act was destroyed by the Supreme Court, or at the very least gutted, they're probably talking to some people of color whose ability and access to vote is going to be affected. So it seems interesting that in this area, the people whose existence is being questioned and whose rights are being taken away or constrained, that they don't seem to feel that same need.
Yeah, and it's not just the New York Times, unfortunately. We also looked at coverage of anti-trans legislation on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. We found that MSNBC had trans guests in 22% of their segments. CNN had trans guests in 16% of their segments. Fox News had trans people in 0% of their segments about anti-trans legislation. And again, they actually devoted less time to the topic than they've devoted to the Trans Day of Visibility Easter overlap, which I think is really revealing because it shows that really this is just about anger and generating attention and not about the actual impact of their movement, right? If I were part of an activist movement that was actually passing a lot of laws, I would probably want to hear about the success of those laws, but Fox News would rather just make their audience mad because that's what they do.
Exactly, like the vague idea that trans people are killing Christianity is more exciting than the actual legislative work being done against trans people. I have a quick aside because you sort of brought up a topic I've been thinking about recently. Ron DeSantis, sort of one of his appeals as a presidential candidate was that he's more focused on this than anyone else. And obviously he utterly failed. Does it seem like maybe they're less interested as a movement in the specifics, in the law stuff? I'm not saying that they're not still introducing the laws. Many have been introduced just in 2024. But have you noticed perhaps a little bit of a changing of the way that the trans people are being discussed, the way that the movement that opposes trans people is operating?
I think we're still living through a moment where a lot of people are finding out that some people are trans for the very first time and feel very compelled to take strong stances on the moral righteousness or effectiveness of those lived experiences. That's got to wear off eventually, right? Exit poll after exit poll and polls of likely voters have shown that this is not a priority for a lot of voters. And we have a lot of evidence from the 2022 midterms, from the 2023 Kentucky governor's election, where the Republican campaign went all in on the idea that the Democratic candidate would gut women's sports, and he won anyway in a Trump state. Voters just are not really focused on this. It's something that I think generates clicks, but clicks and votes are not the same thing.
Yeah, and it's the interesting thing where, especially for the like independent right wing, they will talk about Republican electoral strategy. They'll talk about Trump and that sort of thing, but they also have to appeal to the audience. And I don't feel like those two goals are always going hand in hand. Like the thing that gets trolls online fired up aren't necessarily the same things that wins you presidential elections or congressional elections. That's what I think I've noticed. Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.